Hello, everybody. I am Jose Gomez, and I'm going to be doing the presentation on Epicor REST and Functions. This presentation is really about understanding and how to use the REST interface. So the REST interface was introduced back in 10.1500 Epicor version, and basically is when Epicor made the switch from SOAP-based business objects to RESTful objects. And that may not mean a lot to you, but basically the web has really won the standard for communication between services. So Epicor has always been written in what's called a service-oriented architecture. So that basically what that means is that every action you take on a screen, there's an equivalent backend service or call that can be made to replicate that. So when you click new on your front end, there is a back-end service that can be invoked to mimic what that new button does. And Epicor in 10.1500 moved from SOAP, which was an older technology, to REST. And REST just means that that it uses the standard verbs of the web to communicate. And again, super technical, but basically it just means that it acts like any website would. So when you're running your Epicor Classic, or even when you're running, when you're running your Epicor Kinetic, or even when you're running your Epicor Classic, anytime you click around the application, open a screen like AR entry, open ABC code, create a BAQ, every time you do one of those actions, Epicor behind the scenes is communicated with the server via this REST endpoints, right? And there's basically four main ways to interact with any of the Epicor services, right? You are either trying to retrieve information, so you're trying to get data out, right? You're trying to execute a BAQ, or you're trying to get customer information, and that's using that get verb in the web protocol. You're trying to create something new, right? You're trying to make a new invoice, you're trying to make a new BAQ, and that uses what's called the post verb. And then you have update and delete, right? Update allows you to make changes, and delete allows you to remove a record, right? So that is a very basic gist on how REST works and how to interact with REST. So there is a bunch of, basically you can call them web apps if you wanna consider them that way, that are sitting on the Epicor side waiting for you to interact with them, and you can interact with them through either a standard web browser or one of the many tools that are available. And this can be very, very useful to write things like integration, like for example, Automation Studio. When for those of you that have Automation Studio, Automation Studio communicates with Epicor through this interface, through REST, right? So every time you go to Automation Studio and you say something like, when I get a new order, Epicor is interrogating, or not Epicor, but Workato is having a conversation with your Epicor server via these REST endpoints. And any other tool that you might run into, like I said, including but not limited to the classic interface, the kinetic interface, all those things use this web services, these REST services to communicate. And all of that is sitting on top of a standard called OData. Again, not going to go into a ton of detail, but just to give you some peripheral information around this. So whenever you interrogate an Epicor service, you do so using what's called the OData standard, right? So for example, if you say, I want to retrieve ABC code, right? You're going to use that get verb from the web, and you're going to ask Epicor to hand you or give you back some ABC code data. But if you want to do some filtering, some narrowing down of information, you would use the OData standard to interact with those endpoints. Now, I know this is a lot of rambly technical stuff, but I'm going to show you what I mean in a second. So let's take a look at how you can interact with the web interface, or not with the web interface, but with the REST interface in Epicor. So Epicor is nice enough to provide us with a REST interface help. So if you go into your Epicor instance, whether you're cloud or on-premise, and you navigate to your server and your instance name, and then so your server here, then you have your instance name, Epicor Demo or Epicor Live or Epicor Production, and then API/help. This is going to take you into the REST help page. This REST help page is a place where you can test out and interact with the REST endpoints yourself, and you can start to understand a little bit of how they work, right? When you first access this help page here, it will ask you to log in using your Epicor username and password. Or if you're using Azure, it'll let you authenticate using something like your Azure Active Directory or even your Epicor identity. But once you're here, you can click here on this little hamburger menu, and you can see that you have a list of services that are available to you through the Epicor REST help, right? So you can interrogate or communicate with any business object, any library, any process in Epicor, and even run reports. You also have special endpoints for running BAQs and Epicor functions, which we'll get a little bit into in a while. But for example, let's say that I wanted to understand a little bit better how these different verbs that I was talking about, the post, patch, delete, and update work to interact with some of the Epicor business logic, right? So in Epicor, if I just go into my normal interface, not the Epicor help API one. So if I just go into the regular application and I bring up the ABC code screen, I'm going to go ahead and hit F12 here, and this is going to bring out what is called the developer tools for the browser, right? And you're going to see that when I click on this A here, a get by ID call is going to be made to that REST interface, right? So the Epicor REST interface, right, that we just looked at here in the business object space has an ABC code endpoint, right? And what happened is when I clicked on the screen and I clicked A, Epicor made a call to the ABC code endpoint and said, run get by ID. And it actually passed in the letter A as the payload. So if you come here into the REST API and you look at the help information for ABC code, you can actually see that you can affect those calls yourself. And it actually tells you in here what verb you are using for the call. So if I'm going to do a get by ID call, right, I'm going to use the get verb, right? And I can even try it out in here. So this is a very, very nice sandbox for you to play on or test out your theories. So if I wanted to retrieve the information on ABC code, how could I do that? Well, I would come in here into my API help. I would find the business object for ABC code, and then I would execute the get by ID method. And I can hit try it out here. It's going to ask me for the company identifier, right? Because everything in Epicor is company specific. And then it's going to ask me to pass in the code that I want to retrieve. So code A, for example. The other thing it asks me for is this API key. So let's take a little pivot around that. So all the interactions that take place via REST, specifically REST version 2, which is the one that we're going to be using, require what's called an API key. An API key is a way to secure your interactions so that random people on the internet can't really interact with your Epicor instance, right? API keys are all managed by your ERP administrator roles. And in the cloud, I think some super users can have access to creating them, but you may have to request support to do it. But you need an API key in order to interact with any Epicor business object via REST. So that is done from the API key maintenance screen. So if you go into Epicor and you search for API key maintenance, you'll have this screen here. And this allows you to create an API key. So I'm going to create a quick API key so that we can do some testing on that ABC code business object. So I'm going to click new here, and I'm going to say my open API key, give it a name, and hit save. Now, when I hit save, you're going to get this message that says the API key value can be used in REST calls. But one thing you need to remember is this will never be displayed to you again. So if you're going to save that, and you need to, you want to make sure you copy that and save it somewhere secure, because this API key now has access at the moment to every function or business object within Epicor as long as they have a valid account in the system, right? So I'm going to copy that API key, and then I'm going to keep it in a safe place. This API key can now be used in this example here to actually make that call to retrieve the information from ABC code, right? So I can come in here and I can set my API key to that value that I just copied, right? And now if I hit execute, you'll actually see that we get back the information about ABC code A in a JSON document, right? JSON document or a JSON is a language that is the standard of the web for interchanging information between two different endpoints. So I can make a call now using quote unquote REST to access ABC code, right? Why is this important? Why is this relevant? Is because with these endpoints and that API key, you now as an ERP administrator or even as a user have access to getting data directly out of the system or interacting with the system as if you were another interface, right? So you have your classic Epicor interface, you have your kinetic interface, and now you have the option to write any service, integrate with any product, and actually interact with Epicor as if you yourself were a different interface or a part of the system.
Question from Crystal. Could you please demo the F12 function to trigger the developer tools
sure.
again, please?
Yep, I will. And I'm going to go back through that to give you a couple of examples. So let's go back over here in Epicor. So again, in Epicor, if you want to understand what Epicor does on the screen, let's say you're trying to replicate this ABC code maintenance function or screen somewhere else. Let's say you have an application you're trying to write that allows you to interact with ABC code. It is important that you understand how Epicor does what it does, right? When I click this A button, what does Epicor do? When I make a change, let's just say I change my stock here from 80 to 75, and I click save, what does Epicor do? So the way that you can do that is to tracing Epicor's activity. Now in Epicor Classic, in the Classic interface, there was a tool built into the system that provide you traceability. So you can turn that on. I don't know if you can turn that on in here. No, you can't. In the Classic interface, you can go to the settings menu and turn on tracing. So you can go here in tracing options and enable trace logging, right? And you can track changes. And so what that will do is it will show you all the different methods and all the different calls that Epicor makes to interact with anything, including ABC code. So let's go ahead and do it here in the classic interface. So I'm going to type in A, and I'm going to change this to 80, and I'm going to hit save. If I now go back to the tracing options and I click View, I will actually see all the different endpoints that Epicor called to interact with the business objects I was working with. So here's ABC code get by ID, right? And then here's the parameter that Epicor sent in, right? Then if I look a little further, I can see that it also called ABC code update, right? And I can see if I turn that on, which I didn't, I can see what changed on those parameters, right? That was the way to do it in the classic interface. But in the new web interface, they have not yet provided us with a tool to do that. But there's a set of tools that we have available to us that we can still use to do the same thing. And that has to do with this developer tools I was talking about. So if you come into the screen, into the Kinetic screen, and hit F12, you will be taken to what's called the developer tools in the browser, right? There's a bunch of information here, but the one that you might be interested most is this network tab. This network tab will show you a lot of the same information that you get out of the tracing here on the Epicor side, right? So for example, if I click on that A again, you can see that Epicor makes a call to ABC, ABC code get by ID, right? And I can see the payload of what that call looks like. I can also come back here and change this back to 75 and click save. And you can see that Epicor then makes a call to update and it passes in a data set that has been updated. That is how you interact with the standard developer tools for traceability and to get kind of a feel of what different REST endpoints Epicor is using with their tool. Now we have a Chrome extension that is freely available. It's called the Kinetic UX Trace utility that goes a little bit further and it kind of gives you a little bit of extra help. So this is one of those tools that I use all the time when I'm trying to trace information and replicate what Epicor has done. So if you go into Chrome Web Store and search for Kinetic UI Trace or search for Epicor, you'll see this extension. And once you install it and you go back to that developer tools here, hitting F12, you'll see a new tab here called Kinetic UX Trace utility, right? Now, what this utility does when enabled is it actually gives you a snapshot of the individual calls that Epicor does without any of the noise that the browser makes on its own, right? It also allows you to generate a curl command, which you can use to test the calls yourself. and it does a bunch of other useful information. So let's now look at that same set of steps that I took, but let's use this kinetic trace utility. Again, hit F12. Once you've installed the extension, go to the kinetic UX trace utility and click enable trace logging. This is going to tell you that tracing is now enabled and you need to refresh the page in order to begin tracing. So you can click yes, it will refresh the page, and what it does is it actually inserts itself in between you and the Epicor server so that it can take a look at all the different calls the system is making. So now, once again, I'm going to click on A. I'm going to change this to 80, and I'm going to click save. And now, if I go here, I can see all the different business objects that Epicor interacted with during the current session. So I can scroll down here and find ABC code, and I will see that it called 3 different methods: get rows, get by ID, and update. So let's look at get by ID. Get by ID here, I can see that Epicor made a call to the URL of the REST endpoint right here, and the method post that it used, right? I also can see any body information that was sent. So it sent ABC code A as the parameter. And on the right side here, I can see what Epicor returned. I can see that Epicor returned the record for that ABC code, right? Then if I want to see what it did for update, I can select that and I will see the same information. What was sent on the left, right? It sent 2 records. It sent the original record that was retrieved, and then it also sent an additional record with a row mode of view that was changed. So you can see here the value was 80, changed to 80, and the original value, the unchanged record, was 75. And then on the right side here, I can see what Epicor returned or responded with from that call. So this is a tool that I use a lot to learn how to interact with the REST interface, right? What's really neat about this tool is that you can also go get another tool called Postman, which is a freely available tool that allows you to pretend you are the browser, right? This tool allows you to make those calls like get, post, patch, and delete, and pretending you are the browser without having to physically click around in the browser. So I'll show you what that tool looks like here. So here's Postman, right? And if I wanted to make a call to Epicor, one of the things that I could do is I could actually use the trace utility here to generate what's called a curl command. I can click that and copy this, and that's going to now be able to be imported into Postman. And when I do that, I now have the ability to execute that call that Epicor did, but in Postman. So I can click send here, and you can see that I get back the information from the system just as if I was a browser, right? And the nice thing about this tool is it also provides you code. So you can then turn this request into code that is written, for example, in C# or Python or Dart or Java, JavaScript, Node. Pick your poison, right? This will give you ready-to-use code that you can copy, paste, and insert into an application that you're writing or a tool that you're using, right? So this is a very useful tool for interacting with that REST interface. So I know this is kind of like a high-level overview, and there's a lot of technical detail here. I don't have a ton of time to go into the full details, but I will show you the power of this. For example, when you want to write a simple application that interacts with Epicor. So here I have an empty program, console program from C#, right? I'm going to write some code, and I want to write some code that, for example, executes a BAQ, right? I want to retrieve all my customers' information. We all know that Epicor has a BAQ out there available called zCustomer01, right? So we can actually go into the REST API helper and click on the BAQ queries here and look for zCustomer01, right? This is a BAQ that can be executed in here, and its entire job is to return the basic information on a customer. Things like customer number, customer ID, address, and so forth. So in the REST interface, I can execute zCustomer01 by clicking this try it out button, right? Remember I already have my API key set, right? And I can simply hit execute. And when I do that, I can get all my customer information. So here's good old Ace Brown and Ace Mold and Addison and so on, all the ones that we are used to seeing. So this is actually executing that BAQ using the REST interface. Now here in the middle, you can see the OData filters or the OData selectors. This is what I was talking about earlier when I said that the REST interface is built on an OData standard. And what Microsoft did, which was the creator of OData, is that they kind of created it to simulate SQL. So if you're a person who understands SQL, OData comes pretty naturally to you because it has a select statement, which means that it allows you to select specific pieces of information from what's available. By default, this query has a bunch of fields, right? It has company, cost ID, name, address, city, state. But maybe I just want to retrieve the customer ID and the customer name. I can use that OData selector here to tell it what field specifically I want to retrieve so that I don't get so much information back. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to say I want only customer cost ID in my selector, comma, and I also want the customer name, right? And I'm going to execute that. And now I get just those two pieces of information from the customer. I also can see here what that URL request looks like, right? It was a request to the REST endpoint for executing the customer one, and then they passed in a select equals to customer ID and customer name. So I can kind of see how the OData protocol works. I can also do filters, right? Maybe I only want to get a customer ID, this guy, right? So I can go into my filter, right, and say customer cost ID equals to that. And now when I execute, I should only get the result filtered down to that level. And I'm doing all this through this basically URL, right? I'm doing all this through that basic interface, the REST interface to get information. But what's really nice about it is that I now have the power to do all this in a custom program with only a handful of codes, a handful of lines of code. So I'm going to walk through a very quick example on how to accomplish that same exact thing in C#, and how you can interact with the REST interface this way. Here again, you can go into Postman just like we talked about, and you can find the C# HTTP client code, and you could copy all of that and paste it into Postman and execute it, right? But there are also tools available that the community has written that make interacting with the REST API in Epicor super, super easy in things like C#. So you can go here, for example, in a C# project, you can go into Tools, Nugget Packet Manager, and Packages for this solution, and then search for Epicor. If you search the Epicor, the NuGet store for Epicor, you'll see that there's an Epicor REST API core wrapper and an Epicor REST wrapper. These wrappers here make it super, super easy to interact with the Epicor REST API in .NET languages, C#, VB.NET, and so forth. So now that I have installed this package, I can very, very quickly replicate the execution of this customer BAQ to get some information by using a handful of C# lines.
Question from Norberto. Is it possible to pass OData filters in the headers payload instead of in the URL?
No. Well, so it depends on the method, right? This is a get method for executing BAQs. And get methods require that all the information be sent on the URL. If we go to a different business object, for example, back to ABC code, and we're executing like a post, right? The data here is sent as a payload in the body of the request. So not in the headers, but in the body on the request. So it really depends on which endpoint you are addressing and the method you are using. But no, 99% of the information that you're sending to the Epicor site is going to be either on the body of the request or the URL itself. There is a handful of headers that are sent or can be sent that can affect your outcome. So there's a call settings header, which allows you to switch companies. So you can pass in a call settings header that's going to contain your company and your plant, language, format, culture, and time zone offset. And that one can be used to do that. So if you're in a multi-plant situation like I am, we have 42 plants. When I make a REST call, I always have to pass in a call setting so that I know which plant and company I am in. And there's a few other ones. There's session info if you're using an Epicor session. There's license, which allows you to select which license ID you want to claim. For example, if you have MES, you can use an MES license for some of these calls. If you have a web service license, which is something you can also get from Epicor, you can also use a web service license. And this has to do with what license is going to be consumed when you make the call into the Epicor server. And there's a couple of other headers here that you don't use that often, but All the other standard HTTP headers are also available, but as far as Epicor is concerned, really the call settings, your session, and your license are going to be the ones that you're going to be passing in. But outside of that, you do not pass any information to Epicor on the headers. I think call context is another one that you may do on the header side.
Is the Epicor REST node npm package being maintained? The GitHub link is
Yes.
404.
I probably just the GitHub link. Oh, I don't think it's published as a open source, but yes, the Node npm package is being maintained, and I actually have an example on Node that I can walk through as well. But yeah, if you look for this guy here, Epicor REST node, that is still being maintained and still being used heavily. We have an entire customer and sales portal and all sorts of things that use it. So yes, this is very heavily maintained. We actually, I think, published an update just a couple of months ago to this particular package here. So
Thank
yes,
you.
but yes, this GitHub URL here may not pull up for you because it's not a public repository, right? It's a private repository that me and Josh are maintaining. But if anybody wants to maintain it with us or help, let us know and we will take PR. So yes, it is definitely being maintained. All right, so I want to now mimic the same information that I did on the REST API here, where I was executing the zcustomer01 BAQ or query. I want to do that in a C# application or in a Node application. Actually, the code is very, very similar. And I'm going to use that Epicor REST helper that I was talking about. So I gotta just simply instantiate my Epicor REST helper as a REST client. And then I just have to give it information about where my Epicor application is, right? So the REST client here needs to know where I'm hosting my application, right? So what the name of the server that is hosting my Epicor application is. So in this case, this is my server. If you are on the cloud, it would be the name of the server of your URL. So your cloud URLs are usually like mycompany.epicorcloud.com/something or other. That mycompany.epicorcloud.com would be what you enter here without the name of your server, right? Just the actual host of the application. Then you are going to give this thing what we call the pool instance. The pool instance is what application are we communicating with. In our case, we have like 15 different Epicor copies that we run on a daily basis for development purposes. We have Epicor A, B, C, D, E, F, live, pilot, train, education, demo, and so on. So here is you're telling the system which Epicor instance you're using. Again, for cloud people, this is going to be like, is it your third database? Is it your production database? Or is it your pilot database? So in here, I'm going to put in Epicor demo because this is my demo instance. And then I just got to give it a username that has access to Epicor. So this is going to be the very secure Epicor username here. And then I got to give it the password for Epicor. There we go. So that username and password. You can then give it a company ID as well. If you have multi-company instance, you're going to need that. So Epicor 6 is the education database in this case. And you can do some other headers in here too that you guys were talking about. So here's a call settings header. And so I could give it a call settings if I wanted to switch plants, right? So I'm going to go with Epic 06 and I want to be in the MFG sys plant, right? And then language, if you care, you can be like English US and you can do something with culture. So these are some of the headers that are available. Again, these are all available in the Epicor REST interface as well. And last but not least, you need to give it an API key, right? So I can set the API key. And that's going to be the API key that we generated earlier that I probably lost already because I am great at. Oh no, here we go. All right. So I'm going to copy that and I'm going to give that to the library. So now I have set up the very basic settings needed to now interact with the Epicor REST interface from a C# application. So now I want to just do a simple BAQ execution. I want to execute that BAQ01. Right? Well, the helper has built-in endpoints for executing BAQ. So there's BAQ get, right? There's a BAQ get async, and there's a bunch of other ones, BAQ patch async. There's BO get, BO patch. You can kind of see the pattern here, right? Your gets, your patches, your puts, your deletes are all replicated in this helper. So if I go back to my API helper here, and I pull up my BAQ for zcustomer01, I can see that this is going to be a get method. So I need to do a BAQ get, right? So I'm going to say BAQ get, and then I got to pass in the BAQ ID, zcustomer01. Now, I can pass in some of those filters like we did earlier, right? Some of those OData filters like the selectors and all those things. But in this case, I'm not going to pass in any of those. This is an optional parameter, so I'm going to skip it. And then also I can pass in a call context header. Again, for those of you that are familiar with Epicor on the technical side, you have something called call context where you have call context client and call context BPM that allows you to pass some additional information to the Epicor side of the operation, so you can handle it on the BPM side. So you can see things like, which client is this running? So for example, is this call coming from a mobile app, or is this call coming from a custom web app that somebody wrote? For now, I'm just going to execute the BAQ by itself without any additional parameters, and I'm going to get that response back. All right, so as easy as that, I am now able to execute that BAQ and get that result back, right? So let's go ahead and print the result. So I'm going to check to see if my BAQ result doesn't have any errors, right? So if it's not an error response, then I'm going to simply do a console.write, and I'm going to print the BAQ results into the screen response body. And that's it. So basically, if you don't count the setup, I need to use 1 and 2 lines of code to execute a BAQ within a C# application. And this is actually going to do all the setup for us on the REST side and allow us to make those calls in there. So I'm going to run this through now and kind of show you. I forgot to put a break here, so I'm going to put it at the bottom here so we don't lose it. And you can see that I got my information. I got a bunch of information about the from running the BAQ or the customer's information, right? So now if I wanted to, I could write an integration. So I could do this call where I get my list of customers and then I loop through that response and I maybe send the customer list now to another service that may want to synchronize with Epicor or things like that. So again, the REST interface makes this super easy and super trivial to communicate with any application in very, very easy interaction. And again, this is custom code, but you can do the same exact thing even with, for example, Excel. You can go in Excel and use the OData endpoints to do the exact same thing. So in Excel here, you can go to data and do get data from an OData feed, right? And it's the same exact thing. You can then execute a BAQ within Excel and extract data out of the system by just giving it a basic URL and some login information. The REST interface is very powerful because you can communicate with it almost any way you can think of. Any questions about the basics of how and why you want to use or understand the REST interface? The same exact exercise, by the way, because somebody was asking about Node, can be done on the Node side, right? I will post these examples later and I can walk through it if we have time. But it's almost the exact same code. You set up your application REST API and then you just make your BAQ call using BAQ get.
A couple things, Jose.
Yep.
One, if you could also post those URLs where people can get things
Yep.
on Epi users, that would be great.
I will. Yep.
Also using your OData, a lot of people have asked in the past, how do I get information into Power BI? So just like Jose was showing with Excel, that's how you do it with Power BI.
Yep, exactly the same way.
From Greg, how are exceptions handled with REST?
So exceptions are just errors, right? Like anything else. So it depends on the interface. For example, in this example here, if I were to execute a BAQ that doesn't exist, right, I would get an exception here. I would get an error state on this call. So if I run it again, my error response is true, and I can actually now look and see that there is an error being returned here that says 404 dynamic query not found, right? So you would handle it in the individual interface that is interacting with REST. So if you're doing in C#, you would do kind of like what I did and check to see if it's an error. And if it is an error, you would handle that in some fashion, right? You would display a message. You would say, hey, you typed in the wrong BAQ or something like that. Excel would give you an error as well if you try to run a BAQ that doesn't exist. If you're doing Workato, then they have their own handlers for the errors. Again, the same thing. They would try to execute that BAQ, and Workato would display an error message. So it's no different than any other interface, right? You have to handle those errors. Either the client will do it, or Epicor will do it themselves, or if you're doing a completely custom interface like we are here, you would handle that yourself by checking to see if you have an error.
Thank you. And then from Pierre, With the Excel way to do OData, how do we pass parameters?
So that's a good question. In Excel, when you try to do OData, one of the things that you can pass in is additional. Here, let me see if I can get one set up. I don't use this one a lot, mostly because we use PowerPoint or Power BI. But when you go to set up your OData endpoints, right, your basic OData endpoints, you can do advanced, right? And then advanced allows you to do parameters, right? Each of these parts could be a different parameter that is passed in. Now, they can't be dynamic in this endpoint. And actually, Andrew has a post on Epi Users on an Excel workbook that he set up that allows you to create dynamic parameters. I'll post a link to that as well later on, and I'll send it to Fred and Calvin to post along with any of the notes. But how you would pass parameters here is you would build the URL in pieces, right? So you would say HTTPS, whatever your server is, right? And then Epicor demo, for example, right? That would be the beginning of your endpoint. You can then go into the API helper, and let me switch to version 1 real quick so that I can execute zcustomer01. So again, if I go to zcustomer01, I can now execute this OData endpoint. So I'm going to say execute right here, and this is the URL that I can make the call with, right? So I'm going to go and place that URL here. But if I want to pass in additional parameters, again, say if I wanted to do a selector or a filter, right? Let's say, again, I only want to get customer ID and customer name, whoops, right? I can come in here and execute it, and I will get what that URL looks like, right? And I can then copy that in to the other parts of the call here. So I can say that is a question mark. I'm just copying it from the other side, right? Question mark, and it's gonna be select equals to customer cost ID, comma, customer, oops, comma, customer underscore name, right? So now these are parameters that are gonna be passed at the end of my URL here, right? To allow me to make the call to Epicor. Right, so now I can hit OK here, and hopefully it'll ask me for a username and password, which I can authenticate here with Epicor, and I can hit connect. And it should execute and download that data. There it is, right? All the data was downloaded into my Excel sheet, and I can bring that into Excel. And so that was an interaction from Excel that does the OData endpoint. And it looks like I didn't double check my parameter there, but that's how you would do that interaction. All right, so we don't have a lot of time left, so I wanted to cover functions very quickly, make sure that we get to that. Functions is a very powerful, newish tool that was added to Epicor recently. I think 10.2 maybe was the first release that contained it. And a function is, all it is basically a little bit of logic that you can host within Epicor that you can call and execute via REST anytime you want to, right? What that means is, it's like, say I have something that I do over and over again. Maybe I say I send an email to the customer once a week, or I run a report on a schedule, or I want to write an integration with another tool that allows me to create new customers. You can actually use Epicor to host most of the logic of creating those tools, and then all you have to do is call that function in REST to execute that bit of code, right? So a couple of things to keep in mind. In order to access Epicor function maintenance, you need to have special user security. So if you go into your user accounts and you pull up your user, there's a set of groups that you need to have access to: function developer, administrator, and or power developer. A combination of any of those will give you access to the function maintenance screens. But if you don't have that, you won't be able to actually see or write functions. All right. So once you have that access, you can write a simple function. So you can come in here and add a function library. A library is nothing more than a collection of functions, right? It's a collection of different functions you want to execute. So I'm going to create a simple hello library. And down here on the right, you can see the different kinds of functions you can write, right? There's the standard code widget functions. There's also custom code functions, which allow you to write completely custom code. And then you can also even choose to read and write information to the database or not. There's a lot more to the function setup that we could get into don't have a lot of time. The biggest one that always bites me and all my developers is that once you create a function, it's still not usable by anyone unless you go into security and give the company that you want access to it. So in this case, I'm in the education database. So I'm going to authorize the education database. Hannah says it doesn't bite her. I don't believe it, but that's fine. So anyways, you give the education database access to this function. So this function library now is accessible by the education database, and I can write a simple function. So I'm going to do a simple widget function, just because I don't have to write code. And I'm going to call this world for hello world. And then you have something called a signature. A signature is a place where you can set the parameters that are coming in and out of this function. So for example, if I have a hello world function, I maybe want to send the name of somebody in, and I want to respond with hello person, person being the name they sent. So I can come in here into my signature and create an input called name, iname, and I can get an output called output message. We have a standard in our company where every function also returns a success flag, and that lets us know if the call was successful or not. It's just an easy way for us to know if the call to the function succeeded or if there was some error that happened that hurts us along the way. But that is a standard that we have created. It isn't a standard that Epicor requires, right? So we always have that success flag, and that is the first thing we check to see if the call was successful. But I'm going to go ahead and remove it for this demo. Okay, so I have a simple function now in a library called hello in a function called world that takes in a name and returns a message. So I can now edit the function, and all I want to do is populate that output message with a hello world to the person that sent it in. So I can come in here and do a set argument or field, and I can say that I want to set my output message. And I want to set my output message to hello plus the parameter of the name, so that it will respond with hello name, whatever the name might be. Simple as that. And I can save it. And now that function is available to use, but I haven't published it yet. But functions have two states. They have a published state and an unpublished state. And so you can choose to publish that function to make it available to everybody else. And that's when you promote this library to production, right? So now I have a function that is hopefully available to me to use. So I can go back to my REST API helper. Oh, sorry, not that one. Where's my REST API helper? Here it is. I can go to my REST API helper and now click on functions, and I can see that I have my hello function with my world library or my world function available here, and I can try it out, right? And it wants me to pass in a name, right? So I'm gonna pass in a good old Larry, and I'm gonna hit execute. And now we get hello Larry back. So now I have a function that I can invoke from anywhere that REST is available. Functions can also be invoked from classic Epicor directly in your screens using a REST helper. Functions can be invoked by any of the helper libraries, and they are very, very useful. Almost everything that we do with integrations, with interactions in the system, we wrap in a function because a function can be very tightly controlled, right? Going back to API keys, you never, never, never want to have an API key set up the way I did. I have a wide open API key that has access to my entire Epicor information. That is usually not a good thing. API keys have something called access scope. And so you can create an access scope that narrows down what that API key has access to. So you can say, you can create an access scope that gives access to very specific BAQs or very specific libraries or very specific services and methods. And then you can attach that access scope to your API. So that basically, if your API key does get out into the world, they will only have access to a very narrow scope for that API. You never want to have one that is wide open like this. This is just for demo purposes. So again, there's education material around this available in the help and Epicor and all that stuff. I don't have all the time in the world to do this, but I wanted to point that out because I don't want you guys making this mistake.
Jose,
really quick, yeah.
got a question from Crystal. In Epicor, they came from Epicor 9 and we're using Service Connect intensively.
Yep. Okay.
They're in Kinetic, still using Epicor Service Connect, but have been told it's being sunset.
Yep.
What's a good recommended replacement? Automation Studio or doing something with
Studio.
REST Coast? Automation Studio.
Yeah, I would definitely recommend Automation Studio. We use it heavily. It's a good product. It works well. It is I would say, a one-to-one replacement for Service Connect. It does everything that Service Connect could do and then some. So I would recommend going that route because it is a code less or less technical product. If you wanted to write your own code, though, absolutely, you could replicate all the things that Service Connect did with a REST interface, but you would probably have to bring on staff or have somebody on staff that can do custom development on programming. You can also use any other middleware tool, which is what these things are called, right? Because REST is universal. REST can be accessed by almost any tool in the market. So there's Del Boomi, there is, again, the Workato tool, there is If This Then That, there is any tool that markets itself as a enterprise level middleware can be used to basically take the function that Service Connect did and interact with or communicate with REST. The nice thing about Workato or the Automation Studio is that it already knows Epicor out of the box. You don't have to teach it Epicor. Every other tool like Del Boomi and some of these other options, you would have to basically use the REST helpful pages here to give the URLs and all that stuff to that tool so that it can understand how to communicate with Epicor. But there's nothing specifically locking you down to having to use an Epicor built tool because REST is universal language. So I was going to show you, back to my favorite screen here, ABC code. A friend of mine said that ABC code is a screen that Epicor put in place so you can test all your code. So ABC code, I want to show you that you can actually invoke REST directly from the client as well, right? Because the REST is, like I said, is universal. So what I want to do is I just wrote that beautiful little function that says hello world or whatever, and I want to invoke it from Classic. So I can come in here into my customization, draw a button. Please name your buttons and stuff. I just don't have time today. If you don't name your buttons, you'll get a very angry response from me and other people. Don't call them Epi button one. It's hard to maintain, but do what I say, not what I do, kind of thing. All right. So Epicor has a built-in helper for invoking REST from Classic here, and it's called the REST client. So you can, in any customization in Classic, you can go to Assembly Reference Manager and add custom reference, and just search for REST in here. And you'll see that your REST client bubbles right to the top here. You want to bring that into the customization. The other thing you need in here is your session, because it uses the session to authenticate you. So you need the core session DLLs. Once you bring those two DLLs in, you can very easily invoke a function or actually any other REST endpoint by using the Epicor REST client, right? So again, all this is fully and thoroughly documented in the Epicor help. So I'm not going to explain a ton of how it works, but basically you instantiate the REST client like this, and you pass in the OTrans core session. And basically what that does is it uses your current session to generate the information you need and authenticate you to the Epicor instance you're in. So again, so this is creating the REST instance, and then all you need to do is populate that incoming and outgoing parameters that we created in the function. So we have the incoming parameter called iname and the outgoing parameter called omessage. So I'm going to go ahead and again paste this in. I'll make these example codes available as well afterwards if you want to look at it in more detail. But basically the what did I call it? Iname is what you're going to be passing in here, right? So I'm going to blame Fred for this one. And then the function itself, you got to give it the library name, which we called hello, and the function name, which is world. So I'm passing in iname as a function content. This was a published library into hello world. And I'm going to get back what? I'm going to get back an O message, right? I think that's what we declared here. I don't have success because I removed it, but now I have an O message. And then simply, I can just click that button and it should allow me to execute the code. Now it's telling me that the REST client wasn't found. That's because you got to add a specific using at the top there. So just with those 3 lines of code, I am now communicating from the standard classic Epicor client to REST and executing, hopefully, this function. So I can click save here, and I'm going to set demo and close it out and open it back up. And then I should be able to click that button. And if I type everything correctly, we should be able to get back a message that says hello Fred from executing that function on the server side. And this was done again from the classic client. You can do the same exact thing from Kinetic, and again, it is available fully in the entire REST interface. So it is available anywhere across the board. And with that, I think I'm out of time.